The square is crowded, the stones wet from dawn, and a hush rolls over the town as the bell tolls once. A woman stands on a wooden platform, wrists bound, hair shorn to the scalp. Beside her waits a priest with a ledger, a magistrate with a seal, and a torturer with iron cooling in the wind.
They call it justice.
But what unfolds is theatre. A lesson staged for every daughter and mother watching from the edges. Her sentence is read in a voice that carries like smoke, immodesty, insolence, witchcraft, laughter at the wrong man. The crowd leans forward, eager and afraid. A rope is tightened, a brand lifted, a confession demanded. Pain is only the instrument. Humiliation is the script. The body becomes a blackboard where power writes its warnings. Why were women chosen so often for punishments that advertised obedience? Why did law, church, and husband conspire to turn shame into policy? Tonight we follow the trail from bridles that crushed speech to corsets that smothered breath, from trials that performed morality to executions that preached order. This was never about a single victim. It was about making one woman an example and all women an audience. In every society where women were turned into public examples, the architecture of power was already tilted against them. Patriarchy was not just an unspoken custom, it was a legal and spiritual framework that shaped every breath a woman took. To understand why punishments against women carried such theatrical cruelty, we must first examine the systems that made women perpetual suspects in the eyes of their own communities. Religious doctrine laid the foundation. From the story of Eve came a stain that no sermon allowed to fade. Woman was cast as weak, impulsive, and dangerous, a vessel of temptation that could lead men to ruin. This belief was not symbolic, it was policy. Laws across medieval Europe treated women as prone to sin by nature and therefore in need of constant surveillance. A woman who spoke too freely might be labeled a scold. One who managed her own affairs risked charges of witchcraft. Religion sanctified suspicion, transforming ordinary female independence into evidence of rebellion against divine order. Legal systems reinforced this view by denying women agency. In Rome, a woman's identity was legally tied to her father or husband. In medieval courts, a woman's testimony carried less weight than a man's. Even property was framed through male guardianship. If women lacked the rights to own, speak, or decide, then punishing them required no defense. A rebellious daughter could be beaten for honor, a disobedient wife silenced for harmony. Law and custom were designed not to protect women, but to protect control over them. Society itself was structured to make examples of female disobedience. Men risked fines or brief imprisonment for crimes. Women risked public shaming, mutilation, or execution for acts as simple as gossip, refusal of marriage, or rumored infidelity. Communities relied on this imbalance to maintain order. Punishments against women were staged not only to correct one person, but to remind all others of their place. Thus, when women were branded, paraded, or burned, the cruelty did not emerge from chaos. It was the logical outcome of a system built on patriarchal fear. The body of the accused was never just her own, it was a canvas on which the anxieties of church, law, and household were written. And the message was clear: obedience meant survival, silence meant safety, and defiance invited humiliation dressed as justice. Punishment in pre-modern societies was never private. It was staged, ritualized, and witnessed by as many eyes as possible. For women, the purpose went beyond discipline. Their pain was transformed into warning, their shame into performance. By humiliating one woman in front of many, authorities planted fear into every household. The crowd was not just an audience, it was the second instrument of punishment. One of the most common humiliations was whipping in public squares. Men might be beaten behind closed doors, but women were stripped and lashed before neighbors and strangers alike. The body was left bare not only for pain, but for ridicule. In some towns, women were tied to whipping posts at crossroads so every passerby could witness their humiliation. Children jeered, merchants pointed, and priests nodded in grim approval. The whip's sting faded, but the memory of exposure lived on, becoming its own chain of obedience. Another ritual humiliation was the shaving of a woman's head. In patriarchal cultures, hair was more than vanity. It was a symbol of honor, femininity, even sanctity. To strip it away was to erase identity. Women accused of adultery, gossip, or heresy were marched through towns with bald scalps or shaved patches, sometimes smeared with tar or ashes. Paraded on carts or forced to walk barefoot, they were presented like living lessons, mocked by songs and insults. This spectacle turned private lives into public theatre, binding entire communities to the enforcement of morality. The witch craze magnified public humiliation into full-blown theatre. Trials were staged not to uncover truth but to dramatize the battle between virtue and sin. Women accused of witchcraft were dragged into courtrooms or churchyards, stripped, prodded, and forced to endure invasive tests. Their bodies were searched for witch marks, sometimes with needles driven into flesh while men looked on. Whether guilty or innocent mattered little. The ritual itself reduced women to symbols of corruption, spectacles of shame meant to scare others into obedience. What made these punishments particularly cruel was the imbalance. Men accused of theft or drunkenness might face a fine, but women accused of gossip or disobedience could be flogged, paraded, or mutilated. This double standard revealed the true purpose. Punishing women was never only about justice, it was about performance. By making their humiliation public, societies amplified the warning, turning gender itself into a spectacle of power. Every lash, every shaved head, every forced parade carried a message. Step out of line, and you too will be exposed. The female body became a billboard of obedience. Communities absorbed the warning not only with their eyes but with their imaginations. Mothers whispered the lessons to daughters, wives held their tongues, and young girls grew up knowing that shame was the cost of freedom. Public humiliation was not an accident of cruelty, it was a calculated tool. It silenced women before they spoke, trained them to fear ridicule more than pain, and used their bodies as canvases for communal lessons. Yet the cruelty did not stop with parades or whippings. Societies went further, creating instruments designed to mutilate specifically female flesh. Devices forged in iron carried humiliation beyond the square and into the body itself. Humiliation could be inflicted in words, rituals, and parades, but for women the cruelty often took physical form. Iron, fire, and steel were shaped into instruments not only of pain, but of gendered symbolism. These were not general tools of torture. They were crafted with women in mind, designed to attack the very traits that defined femininity in the eyes of patriarchal society. They silenced voices, mutilated bodies, and scarred sexuality. Each device was a declaration that a woman's identity could be weaponized against her. Perhaps no device embodied gendered humiliation more than the scold's bridle. Forged from iron, it was a cage that locked around a woman's head, pressing metal against her cheeks and forehead. Inside, a spike jutted downward to pierce the tongue. Any attempt to speak drove the point deeper, cutting flesh and spilling blood. The bridle was not about physical destruction, it was about erasure. In towns across Britain and Scotland, women labelled as scolds, a term that meant little more than outspoken, were forced into these bridles and paraded through streets with bells attached. Each jingle announced her humiliation. Her crime was having a voice. Her punishment was losing it. The bridle transformed female speech into spectacle, silencing not only the wearer, but every woman who dared to raise her voice. More brutal still was the breast ripper, a tool of iron claws designed to shred the organs of nurture. Heated until it glowed, it was clamped to the breast and ripped away, tearing flesh, muscle, and skin. Women accused of adultery, abortion, or witchcraft faced this fate before crowds that watched as motherhood itself was mutilated. The symbolism was horrific. The breast, associated with life and care, was transformed into the site of death and shame. By destroying it, authorities declared that womanhood itself could be desecrated for disobedience. Pain was secondary. The true goal was terror, the reminder that even the power to give life could be turned into punishment. Deceptively small, the pear of anguish was shaped like a bulb that opened with a screw. Inserted into the mouth, vagina, or rectum, it expanded slowly, tearing flesh from within. Women accused of sexual sins, adultery, abortion, lesbianism, or simply loose morals were targeted with this tool. The cruelty was both physical and symbolic. A mouth silenced, a womb destroyed, a body violated from the inside out. Unlike a whip or a brand, the pear left no immediate scar, but its purpose was lasting damage, infertility, disfigurement, or lifelong shame. It turned private organs into instruments of public control, attacking precisely what society most feared in women: their power to speak, to choose, to create life. Unlike fleeting torture, the iron corset was designed for endurance. Shaped like armor, it encased the torso with plates of metal, sometimes lined with spikes pressing into flesh. Women wore it not for hours, but for days or weeks, often under clothing, forced to live with every breath compressed and every movement bruised. Its purpose was correction rather than execution. Outspoken wives, disobedient daughters, or women deemed lazy were locked into these devices by husbands or magistrates. The corset turned femininity itself into imprisonment. A garment meant to highlight beauty was reimagined as a cage. It declared that a woman's body belonged not to her, but to those who controlled her. Each device told a story. The bridle punished voice, the breast ripper punished motherhood, the pear punished sexuality, and the corset punished freedom of movement. Together they constructed a map of patriarchal fear. The woman who spoke too boldly, loved too freely, or resisted too openly was marked for humiliation. These instruments were not hidden in dungeons. They were shown, demonstrated, sometimes even displayed in courts or markets as warnings. Their existence was theatre, a constant reminder that cruelty could be gendered and that women lived under weapons designed specifically for them. Iron and flame carved lessons into women's bodies, but these punishments were rarely justified as cruelty. They were cloaked in morality, defended as purification, framed as necessary for social harmony. To understand how brutality endured, we must see how religion and virtue themselves became weapons, turning torture into sanctified ritual. Cruelty does not always announce itself as cruelty. In many societies, especially across medieval Europe, punishments against women were cloaked in the language of virtue, piety, and purification. What appeared to be savage mutilation was justified as moral correction. What seemed like humiliation was presented as sanctification. By framing violence as virtue, authorities made brutality not only acceptable, but holy. Women bore the weight of this paradox. Their suffering was called salvation, their humiliation renamed discipline, their pain sanctified as cleansing. The Church wielded enormous influence over how women were perceived and punished. Priests preached that women carried the burden of Eve, that their nature was weaker, their virtue fragile, their bodies dangerous. To control them was to preserve order. Under this logic, punishments were framed as acts of spiritual defense, as if silencing or mutilating women protected the community's faith. A nun accused of breaking her vows might be whipped before the altar to purify her soul. A woman accused of tempting a priest might be branded not as cruelty but as deterrent. Each lash, each scar was interpreted as moral theatre violence sanctified by the pulpit. Public penance rituals blurred the line between justice and spectacle. Women convicted of gossip, adultery, or heresy were forced to wear penitential garments, sackcloth, masks of shame, or heavy stones strapped to their backs. They walked barefoot through streets, sometimes carrying crosses larger than their bodies, chanting prayers written by priests. The community watched, interpreting degradation as a lesson in humility. For some, this humiliation lasted years. Women were ordered to attend Mass in chains or sit on penitential stools in full view of congregations. The goal was not simply punishment, but the spectacle of virtue reclaimed through suffering. The Spanish Inquisition elevated brutality in the name of morality to a chilling art. Women accused of heresy or witchcraft were not only interrogated, but subjected to tortures justified as saving their souls. Water torture, strappado, and even mutilation were conducted with prayers murmured in the background. Execution by fire was framed not as cruelty but as purification flames, cleansing sin from flesh before the soul met God. For women, the symbolism was especially harsh. Their bodies, viewed as vessels of temptation, were destroyed in ways that targeted sexuality or fertility. The narrative was clear: better to burn a woman than allow her to corrupt others. Many punishments were justified not by crime, but by supposed threats to morality. Women who dressed immodestly, who laughed too freely, or who resisted arranged marriages could be beaten, branded, or locked into devices of shame. Husbands, fathers, and priests claimed this violence was necessary to protect virtue, yet the virtue being defended was male honor, not female dignity. This moral policing was systemic. In some towns, councils passed ordinances allowing husbands to whip wives publicly for disobedience. Communities celebrated these acts as upholding moral order. Brutality was disguised as household discipline, an accepted form of moral theatre. The paradox was devastating. A woman punished in the name of morality often lost the very virtues society claimed to value. Stripped naked before crowds, she lost modesty. Tortured into silence, she lost dignity. Burned at the stake, she lost life itself. Yet each act was narrated as righteousness. Communities applauded, convinced they were preserving morality while destroying the very humanity they claimed to defend. This blending of morality and cruelty ensured that humiliation did not fade after the lash or the brand. It culminated in the most spectacular form of punishment, execution. And when women were executed, their deaths were staged not just to end their lives, but to dramatize lessons for entire societies. When a woman was sentenced to death, her final moments were rarely private. Execution was theatre designed to awe the crowd, terrify the living, and enshrine authority in ritualized violence. For women, these deaths carried layers of symbolism that transformed their bodies into public sermons. Fire, water, and earth were not simply tools of execution, they were stages on which patriarchal power dramatized its control. Few images of female punishment are more infamous than the stake. Women accused of witchcraft, heresy, or adultery were bound to poles surrounded by wood and consumed by fire. Flames licked upward as priests intoned prayers, declaring the fire a purifying element. Communities watched as life was reduced to ash, convinced they were witnessing sin being cleansed. The symbolism was twofold. Fire represented divine wrath, but it also erased the body entirely. In a culture obsessed with female temptation, burning destroyed not only the woman but the physical form that threatened male order. Her body was transformed into smoke, leaving nothing behind but memory and fear. Water was another element woven into women's executions. In witch trials, women were bound and thrown into rivers or ponds, If they floated, they were condemned as witches. If they sank, they were declared innocent but often drowned. The symbolism was stark. Water, seen as cleansing, was weaponized to expose hidden sin. Women's bodies were framed as deceptive, needing to be tested by elements. Communities gathered at riverbanks, watching as life and death played out in a grotesque ritual of truth. Drowning punished women not just with death, but with the spectacle of helplessness, a reminder of vulnerability as a moral flaw. In some cultures, women accused of sexual transgressions faced stoning or burial alive. These punishments were communal. Each stone thrown, each spade of earth piled, implicated the community in her destruction. The crowd became both executioner and witness. The symbolism here was crushing. Stones represented judgment, collective anger hardened into physical form. Burial erased women literally into the ground, silencing them beneath the very earth that had once symbolized fertility. These executions declared that a woman who defied order would be returned to dust by the very society she had betrayed. When pregnant women were executed, the brutality carried an additional message. Their deaths were not only personal, but generational. Executing both mother and unborn child sent a chilling signal. Rebellion could be cut off at its roots, the lineage erased before it began. In some cases, women were forced to give birth before execution. Their motherhood turned into spectacle. Communities interpreted these deaths as both punishment and prevention, ensuring the memory of brutality extended into future generations. Theatrical executions were designed for maximum visibility. Markets, town squares, and churchyards became stages. Crowds gathered in holiday-like atmospheres, buying food, gossiping and cheering as flames rose or stones flew. These deaths were narrated as morality plays, each detail chosen to reinforce authority. The woman's crime was listed, her body displayed, her suffering prolonged, all to remind the living of their place. Unlike men, whose executions often emphasized treason or theft, women's executions were framed around morality, sexuality, speech, obedience. The spectacle was not about ending crime, but about dramatizing virtue through female suffering. In these theaters of death, women's bodies became sermons of control. Each flame, each wave, each stone carried meaning far beyond the moment. Yet executions were only the final act. The deeper truth lay in how societies systemically turned women into examples long before their deaths, ensuring obedience through humiliation, torture, and spectacle. The history of punishing women is not a collection of isolated horrors. It is a system repeated across centuries and continents, where humiliation and cruelty were elevated into tools of governance. From the lash of a whip in a village square to the flames of a public stake, the message was consistent. Women were not simply punished for their acts, they were transformed into warnings. Their suffering became a spectacle stage to remind every onlooker, especially other women, that obedience meant survival and silence meant safety. What makes this history so chilling is not only the brutality, but the deliberate symbolism. Devices like the scold's bridle, breast ripper, or iron corset were not randomly chosen instruments of pain. They were designed to target speech, fertility, sexuality, and independence, the very qualities that gave women power. Executions by fire or water were not just methods of death, but rituals of erasure, framed as purifications to disguise cruelty as virtue. Each act of violence carried meaning, reinforcing systems of patriarchy through theater as much as through pain. And yet these punishments reveal more about societies than about the women they condemned. They exposed the fears of male-dominated institutions, fear of female voices, of sexuality, of autonomy. The more elaborate the humiliation, the more clearly it shows how fragile those systems felt. To destroy a woman publicly was to reassure the community that order still held, that control remained intact. The echoes of this history still reverberate. Public shaming has shifted from town squares to digital platforms. Women continue to face double standards, their bodies policed, their voices silenced, their autonomy questioned. While the breast ripper and the stake may belong to the past, the impulse to control through humiliation persists, wearing modern disguises. To remember these punishments is not to indulge in darkness for its own sake. It is to recognize how easily cruelty can be reframed as justice, how humiliation can be mistaken for morality, how systems of power can sanctify violence until it feels inevitable. The ruins of old pillories, the rusted remains of iron masks, the myths of devices like the Iron Maiden, all are reminders that societies once built entire theatres around women's suffering. The question that lingers is whether we have fully dismantled those stages or whether we have simply changed their scenery. The silence of a ruined square whispers its warning. When a culture uses one body to terrify all others, it is not punishing crime, it is sustaining control. And until those lessons are unlearned, the echoes of brutality remain alive, haunting every place where obedience is demanded at the cost of humanity.